So one of the most important concepts that we have yet to cover in CSS is positioning of elements. So how do we lay out a page or move a div to the top right, or how do we make an anchor tag wider or add spacing between images? All of that is really important, and it's all related to something called the box model. So the box model is this basic idea that's really central to everything in HTML and CSS, which is that basically every element has a rectangular box around it. So we can see here, I'm just going to go to any web page on MDN. I have the inspector open, and I have the magnifying glass selected. And as I hover over every element, you can see that there's a box around it. So this H2 has a blue box around it. This H1 has a box. Even things that aren't particularly boxy, so this rounded corner div, it still has a box around it behind the scenes. So does this here. And this one is really not round or not boxy looking because it has these rounded corners, but it's still a box. So these boxes are really useful behind the scenes because we can style different properties on them. So there are 4 properties, or 4 different parts of every box. There's a lot more properties, but 4 parts of the box that we can manipulate. So let's suppose that this diagram, which is also from MDN, is of a paragraph. So I have some text in a paragraph, and I give it a orange or a yellow border. And this is what the user sees. Some text and a border. But behind the scenes, there's actually some other things happening. So between the border and the text, there's something called padding. So padding is just the space on the inside of the border. So between the content and the border is padding, and then there's also margin, which is on the other side. It's between the border on the outside and anything else. So we use margin often to add spacing between elements. So if we had 2 paragraphs and I wanted them to be further apart, then I would use margin and increase that. So now we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into actually the syntax of some of the properties that we want to use. Before we do that, I want to just show you 2 things you can look forward to making. The first one, it's not the most exciting, but what is important is that we now have a way of making something that looks like this. Up until now, we don't actually have a way of making these boxes that are connected to one another, that have a width assigned to them, but they're empty, there's no text inside. So we're going to learn about the box model and apply that here to make this tic-tac-toe board. And then we're going to make this portfolio site for a fictional photographer. So this is nice, it's images, it's responsive, so it changes size as I change the window size, and this is a grid. All of this is based off of the concepts we're going to learn here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Sublime here, and I have a really simple document that I've created. So it's just a simple HTML. It has a style sheet connected that's empty aside from a few comments, and then 2 paragraphs. So if I open this up, you can see that it's very basic, very boring, and we're just going to use this to play around with the box model. So I'm going to go to my CSS, and I'm going to select paragraphs. And then I'm just going to copy these comments inside so that I can write some code beneath them, just to visually tell you what I'm doing. So let's start by giving these a border. So this should be review, border, and let's do 2 pixels solid blue. Save that, refresh, and you can see that we get a border all the way around the content. And what you'll also notice is that the content here goes all the way across the screen. Our border doesn't stop right here. And that's because when we make a paragraph, by default, it goes all the way across the screen. So if I want to change the width of the paragraph itself, of the text, I can use the width property. And I'm going to go ahead and give a width of 100, let's do 200 pixels to start. And if I refresh, you can see we've now changed the width. If I inspect, the content is in blue. And then we have a border around it. So the content is blue, and on this diagram, that is this box right here, this element box. And then we have a border that is directly around it. There's no space between the border and the content. One other thing with the width, and also there's a height. So let's do a height of 300 pixels. You can see we've just added a bunch of space. I'm going to get rid of that. But there's a height that we can use, just like width. We don't have to just use pixels. So we can use percentages. And those are really useful. So let me show you. Let's do 50%. And you might be wondering, what is it 50% of? And the answer is that it's 50% of the parent element. So in this case, it's the body that the paragraph is inside of. The paragraph goes halfway across the body. In our case, the body is the entire page, goes all the way across, so we end up with half the page. And what's nice about this, if I change the window size, that also changes. So a lot of people will use this, and we will use it actually. It's used in this image grid. You can see that the images change their width, and that's a percentage. Okay. So I'm going to keep it at like that for now. And then the next property we're going to talk about is padding. And remember, padding is this space between the element and the border. And right now we don't have any space. The border is right on top. So there's a property called padding, and we can give it a number of pixels. And let's do 10 pixels to start. Save the file, refresh, and now we have 10 pixels of padding on all sides. So if I inspect now, you'll see there's now this green content that's introduced. So we have the blue content itself, and then we have the green around it, which is between the border and the content. So we can obviously increment this, and we get a lot more space on the inside. But this is not the only way to set padding. This sets it on all four sides as exactly the same. But sometimes we only want padding on one side or two sides. Just like with border, there are shortcuts for the longer version where we would say border top, 10 pixels, border bottom, 5 pixels. Same thing with padding. I'm going to comment that out. And we can do something like padding left, 40 pixels. And we refresh, and we get padding right here, and that's the only place where padding is. And remember, the space over here, this blue, is not the padding. That's our actual content. That's from this width here. So different, even though it looks like there's space on the right, it's coming from a different place. So another thing that we can do here is play with the margin. So the margin is the last piece of the puzzle. It's the space on the outside of the border, so between elements. So this is going to be useful because we might want to increment or increase this space right here. Or as an example here, this space right here in between the images is set using margin. So it actually looks just like padding, so we can say margin, and let's do something obvious like 100 pixels to start, and refresh. And what happened is we now have 100 pixels of space on all sides of the element on the outside of the border. So if I inspect, you'll see that in Chrome, that's identified as orange. So blue is the content, green is the padding, and orange is the margin. So just like padding, sometimes we only want to set one part of the margin, one side. So we can do something like margin top is 500 pixels, and I'm going to comment this one out for now, and save. And we only get space on the top. On the left, there's nothing. And then more space on the top of this one, nothing on the bottom or the left or the right. So that's margin. So sometimes we want to add values to all sides of the margin, but we don't want to have to do it with 4 different lines. So we don't want them to be exactly the same like they are here, but we don't want to have to say margin top, margin left, margin right, margin bottom. So there's another shortcut, just like for border, where we can do things at once. We can do this, margin, and give it 4 values. So the first one is for the top, and then the right, and then the bottom. Let's do 500 pixels, and then the left. And by doing that, we get this nice 4-sided margin where the values are all different, but we only had to do it in one line. So just to inspect this here, you can see we get the 500 pixels on the bottom, we get the 20 on top, we get the 100 on the left, and then we have our 40 on the right. So there's one last thing that you'll see often with margin, which is margin auto. So what we can do is set the margin to be auto on the left or the right, And what that will do is actually center an element for us. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to comment this out again. And we can write margin, and let's just say 0 margin on top, auto on the left, or on the right, 0 margin on bottom, and auto on the left. And if I make this full size and refresh, you'll see that it centers things for us. So what that means, it's decided that this is 50% because we set that here. And then it figures out the left is auto and the right is auto. So it just does as much as it needs to do, and that will actually center it for us. And then we have 0 on the top and the bottom, so they're scrunched together. What we can also do, there's an even shorter way of doing this, and it looks like this: margin, 0, auto. And so this will set the top and bottom to 0, the left and right to auto. So nothing changes. And we can also use this syntax if I want to add 50 pixels to the top and auto, or I want to add 50 pixels and 20 pixels. The one thing to remember is you need the px there unless the number is 0. So if I do this, it adds 20 on the top, on the left and the right, and then it adds 50 on the top and bottom. So let's recap here just one more time. We've got the inner content, which is right here. We've got padding, which is between the borders, so all we have is padding left. And then we have margin, which is between the border and on the other side, so between elements basically. So in the next few videos, we are going to apply these concepts and use them throughout this course.